Hey, shalom, 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 lakam, what you listen to you all. Hi, Rob Tawab, La Atam, Za Achikam Yawaman Rachagado, Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam Kaya, Hamlakatha Kwa Rob. Repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call Layim La La, but now Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Rachak, Wadash Wamashanal, Zakonim Nawa, Wamalakim, Shawachagado, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists, Bahasham. In the name Yahweh Shai delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is an article on CharlotteAlertsNews.com, and it says, woman with blue hair gets in fight with sister over French fries. All right, it says, I believe that's how you say it, Squire Raymond, 18, was arrested on April 18th, 2026 in Charlotte after getting into a fight with her sister over French fries. It says Squire was at home with her adult sister and her sister's kids. Squire's nieces and nephews were eating when Squire allegedly took a French fry from one of the children's plate. It says the mom of the kids, identified as Destiny, became upset. Squire is accused of then throwing a juice carton that accidentally hit one of Destiny's babies. Squire and Destiny started a fight, throwing punches and scratching each other. The sisters even threw pots and pans at each other. It says cops were called and Squire was arrested, charged with simple assault. All right, let me get another article. All right, this one, it says, same website, and it says, man murders teen girl at South Carolina home with shotgun. It says 34-year-old Sean Xavier Hubbard is accused of murdering Kamaria Tidwell, 18, on May 16th, 2026 in Rock Hill, South Carolina. It says Kamaria was at a residence when a suspect is seen on video approaching her front door and firing off a shotgun. The bullet hit Kamaria and killed her on scene. It says Sean was later arrested on May 17th, 2026 during a SWAT standoff on Fig Branch Road. He is charged with murder and possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. All right, in which, many, things like this, many situations like this and occurrences is, taking prevalence in America, Babylon the Great, because we're in the time of Jacob's trouble. All right, so we're seeing, we're hearing about the wars, rumors of wars, and violence is increasing. All right, they've made it to where pretty much, firearms and things of that nature is very accessible. All right, they've put laws and legislations to where pretty much the law officials is pretty much taking like a back seat, because years ago they would have came for any and every call. All right, for like DV cases, domestic violence cases. All right, and things of that nature you see, but now it's more so to where they're only coming to very serious calls. So what that's doing is it's pretty much creating a society of pretty much lawlessness. All right, so let's get a couple precepts. We'll get Matthew Matthew chapter 24, and we'll get verse 6, and it says, and ye shall hear of wars. I'm gonna start at verse 3, and it says, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privily, saying, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? And Yahushua answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Hamashayach, and shall deceive many. In which, ultimately, we're in those times, to where pretty much people are coming and saying that they're ultimately the anointed. All right, they're saying that they pretty much sent. All right, and this comes in many different facets. All right, but specifically, you have those, it's off groups among the circumcision. All right, you have so-called Christians. All right, you have pretty much so-called truthers and like influencers and stuff like that. Online, pretty much saying that they pretty much sent. All right, but they're ultimately they're leading people to their demise. But it says, many shall come in my name, saying, I am Hamashayach, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, in which, it's been many different wars. All right, it was uh Azerbaijan. I can't remember the other country, but you had Azerbaijan. You also had the Ukraine and Russian war. All right, and it's a few other ones. All right, but then we're hearing of rumors of wars. All right, Iran, the U.S. All right, Taiwan and China. All right, and so on and so forth. Pretty much, it's a heavy spirit of war. All right, the battle drums of war is beating. All right, but it says, "See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." It says, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." All right, and we're seeing that. It says, "And there shall be famines," and it's famines. All right, in which when you go into this word for famine, it says famine, scarcity of harvest. It says through the idea of destitution. It says famine, hunger. So specifically going into like a shortage of food. All right, right here it says the root word. It says to leave behind, forsake, to be left behind, to lack, be inferior, to be destitute of, to lack, to be wanting, to fail. All right, because I wanted to get this because on top of the famine, all right, it's also shortages and destitution and a lack and wanting of oil, gas, all right, jobs, and so on and so forth. Essentially all of these go into the plagues, all right, that's sent upon the earth. All right, but it says, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences." All right, it's multiple different pestilences. All right, the Santa. All right, the Santa is out. All right, it's another one too. I think it's thinking that the N virus or something like that, or the NV. All right, that's another pestilence. But then also different STIs. All right. A couple years ago, it was a lot of cases of STIs, pretty much popping up. All right, in which they stopped reporting on those, but those play into the pestilences as well. It says and earthquakes in diverse places, and it's always earthquakes. It says in diverse places. They even have like an app that you can track them. It says all these are the beginning of sorrows, in which some time ago we was in the beginning of sorrows, in which we're still in the beginning of sorrows. All right, but we're at the pretty much the tail end of it, because we're getting into, we're pretty much in Jacob's trouble, you see, but it's going to continue to increase. All right, but it says verse 9. It says, "Then shall," well, I'm skip down to, I'll read down verse 9. It says, "Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another." All right, because it's going to come a time of persecution. It says, "And many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold." All right. Let me get this in another version. NLT, it says, "Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold." All right, and that's pretty much what's going on. They was fighting over some French fries. All right, and the guy, he pretty much broad daylight. He off the Jake woman. All right, he pretty much off Eve. All right, and there's various different other articles that goes into things like this. You see, but I just got a couple because they pretty much just they was recent. All right, but it's various different occurrences and situations that's happened like that across America, Babylon the Great, and then not to mention the other places around the world. But pretty much going to the point, the love of many is waxing cold. I'm gonna get this word for cold. All right, and it says psycho. It says to be made or grow cold, cool or cold, metaphorically of waning love. You see, because at one point, all right, pretty much there was a spirit of pretty much you look out for your neighbor, or just a common courtesy, you see, but it's no more that common courtesy. At one point people had like road rage, all right, in which it was actual road rage, and people wouldn't really I guess take it seriously, but now people are pretty much in occurrences of road rage. All right, people are actually trying to delete each other, and that's becoming more and more prevalent, you see, because the love of many is waxing cold. All right, so Let's get this. This is Second Ezra chapter 16, and we'll get verse 8. All right, we'll get verse 13. It says, "For strong is his right hand that bendeth the bow. His arrows that he shooteth are sharp and shall not miss, when they begin to be shot into the ends of the world." All right, in which this is a similitude for the ICBM nuclear missiles. All right, because that's the ultimate plague, you see, because the plagues are sent upon the planet Earth. All right, but the ultimate plague is going into the ICBM nuclear missiles, which in the scriptures at times is written as arrows. Verse 14, it says, "Behold, the plagues are sent and shall not return again until they come upon the earth. The fire is kindled and shall not be put out till it consume the foundation of the earth. Like as like as an arrow which is shot of a mighty archer, returneth not backward, even so the plagues that shall be sent upon earth shall not return again." So the Lord has specific plagues that are sent upon the planet Earth, which, they're going to do, as it mentions in Isaiah, the 55th chapter. All right, it's been prophesied that, the plagues are going to be sent. All right, and they're being sent. All right, and they're not going to ultimately be reversed. All right, going into, the pestilences. All right, the shortages, the famines. All right, the wars, the rumors of wars. All right, all of these things are ultimately manifest in these times, and it's going to continue to be manifest. But it says, verse 17, it says, woe is me, who would deliver me in those days? The beginning of sorrows and great mournings, the beginning of famine and great death, the beginning of wars, and the power shall stand in fear, the beginning of evils. What shall I do when these evils shall come?" Excuse me. It says the beginning of famine and great death. All right, which some time ago, that started famine, you see, but we're coming up into a time to where, it's going to be a more stringent famine. It says in great death, death is increasing. It says the beginning of wars. It says, "And the power shall stand in fear." Those that ultimately are in rulership, they're in fear, you see, because their eminence is being taken away from them. It says the beginning of evils. What shall I do when these evils shall come? Behold, famine and plague, tribulation and anguish are sent as scourges for amendment. But for all these things, they shall not turn away from their wickedness, nor be always mindful of the scourges. So 2/3 of Jake, ultimately, the Lord is sending, the scourges. All right, but they ultimately are still in that same mindset. They're being, punished. All right, they're being chastised. All right, you see, but ultimately they're not going to turn back unto the Lord, Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai. They're going to be ultimately, stuck in their wickedness. Verse 21, it says, "Behold, victuals shall be so good, cheap upon earth, that they shall think themselves to be in good case, and even then shall evils grow upon earth, sword, famine, and great confusion." Victuals goes into sustenance, supplies. All right. It's still somewhat, cheap, currently. All right, some time ago it was a little bit cheaper. All right, but things have been getting progressively more expensive. All right, and which right now, it's really expensive in comparison to, a little bit of time ago, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. All right, but things are going to start to be hyperinflated. All right, and it's going to be a shortage of a lot of things as well, to mention, pretty much going into the cars. All right, it's going to be very difficult to get gas. All right, it's going to be very difficult to get, cars with emissions, because being that Esau Edom is pretty much switching over to, the electric to pretty much correspond with his, the NWO, with the digital. All right, pretty much, things are going to be more difficult to get. All right, so that's going to increase a need, for these items. All right, and that's gonna work to drive the prices for those items. But it says, "Behold, victuals shall be so good, cheap upon earth, that they shall think themselves to be in good case." All right, now, at one point, even now, things is high, but people can still move around somewhat, so they in the mindset of they're not really batting an eye at the things that are going on upon the planet Earth. So people are thinking that they're going to be in good case. All right, it says, "And even then shall evils grow upon earth, sword, famine, and great confusion." The sword is increasing, famine is increasing, and great confusion. A lot of people don't don't know what's going on. They just, stuck in the bread and circus. All right, people trying to find out how to get more money, you see. But, it's just showing that it's ultimately manifest that they're in a very confused type of a state. The only people that know what's going on is the prophets. All right. But it says, verse 22, it says, for many of them that dwell upon earth shall perish of famine, and the other that escape the hunger shall the sword destroy. All right. So famine is lurking. All right. And going into, the gas, allegedly, the like fuel and like oil, or more specifically the fuel. All right, it was said, I can't remember where I seen it at, but pretty much the guy was saying that by July 4th, pretty much fuel will run out. So, and that's gonna cause prices to spike. All right, and then also it's gonna play a part in the famine. All right. Verse 22 again, it says, for many of them that dwell upon earth shall perish of famine. A lot of people are going to pass, from this famine. It says, and the other that escape the hunger shall the sword destroy. So those that get past, those that's going to have nourishment, the sword is going to get to them. There's going to be no way around, all right, judgment if the Lord has that set for you. All right. The only ones that's gonna be protected, is the elect. All right, this is Amos chapter 5 and let me see, verse 18 or verse 18. It says, "Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. To what end is it for you?" Because you got so-called Christians, and then those that feel as if the Lord is coming back to deliver them. You see, but ultimately they don't really understand what it is that they're hoping for, you see, because they're not ultimately putting in the work, and they don't ultimately believe. It says, "Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord, to what end is it for you? The day of the Lord is darkness and not light. As if a man did flee from a lion and a bear met him, or went into the house and leaned his hand on the wall and a serpent bit him." All right, so it's not going to be any escape. All right, going back to the scripture that we got, those that essentially escape the famine, hey, well, they're going to be met with the sword. So if it's set, for someone to receive a specific judgment, that's ultimately what's going to happen. All right, and we're in a time to where a lot of people are befalling judgment by the sword. Which the modern day sword is the gun. So just wanted to go into that, because judgment is going out, and we're in the time of Jacob's trouble. So I don't want to zaza ba. Lord's with us, a beautiful edification of the spirit. Water on Tazah, Thami Lord's will, you have a good night. Wa shalom lakam, which is peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.